Hello my crafty friend, this is Juliana Michaels and welcome to my channel. In this video I'm going to be sharing how I created this Halloween card featuring some of the new stamp sets from the Tim Holtz Stampers Anonymous 2023 Halloween release. For this card I'll be working with Shattered, Foreboding, and the Obscure stamp sets. And as I share how this card came together, I'll take you step by step through how I used the various stamp sets and more. The finished size of this card is a little larger than my normal A2. This one is A6 in size, which is 4.5 by 6.25 inches. I actually started off with my standard size, but during the creative process, I decided to enlarge it so that all of the elements weren't so crowded and that more of the background paper would show. If you're interested in the exact products I used to create this card, you can find links to them in the description box below. When you shop through those links, it supports me, and I appreciate that so very much. Now let's get on with the making. I'm going to begin by placing a piece of distressed watercolor paper cut to 4 by 5.75 inches into a splat box. I'm using watercolor paper because I'll be adding distressed mica spray stain and ominous twilight, and this kind of paper is perfect for using with wet mediums such as sprays. And I'm working in the splat box so that I don't get spray ink all over my craft space. Before I begin spraying, I make sure to shake the spray well until the mica is mixed into the liquid. If you can see the mica on the bottom of the bottle, you need to keep shaking it until that is mixed in. Once it is well mixed, I sprayed the ink onto the paper. To get the ink to move over the paper, I spritzed it lightly with some water using my distress sprayer. I then used my heat tool to dry the paper. The mica spray stains add so much gorgeous shimmer and shine. To add some interest though, I added some larger water droplets by slowly pulling the trigger of the distress sprayer. I used my heat tool to start the drying process. I then used a paper towel to dab it dry and lift off some of the ink, and then dried it again with my heat tool. I love the interest that this step adds to the already gorgeous shimmery background. For the next step, I'm going to be working with embossing powder, so you want to make sure that your paper is completely dry. Embossing powder can stick to wet paper, so again, just make sure it's thoroughly dry. Now I'm going to be adding some heat embossing to the background using the Shattered stamp set. This stamp actually comes with its own stamping block, but I prefer to use a stamping platform just in case I need to re-stamp the image for any reason. I then place the paper into my stamping platform, and to help hold it in place while I stamp, I'm applying a bit of repositionable adhesive to the back side of the paper. This is particularly helpful when working with large background stamps such as this one, which is actually larger than my paper and will keep me from being able to use the magnets to hold the paper in place. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be heat embossing the image, so here I'm applying embossing ink to the stamp. I'm using Versamark watermark ink, but feel free to use any embossing ink you like. The small black thing I'm using in my hand is called a Stampendable stamp tool, and it just allows me to apply good even pressure without having to push through my fingers. After I stamped the image, I removed the paper from my stamping platform and placed it over a piece of computer paper folded in half. I then poured gold embossing powder over the paper. I continued to add embossing powder until the entire image is covered with the powder. As you can see, the embossing powder sticks to the embossing ink. I then tap off the excess powder and return it to the jar. To make the embossing powder permanent, you must apply heat. Here I'm holding the paper with a pair of tweezers so that I don't accidentally burn my fingers. I'm then applying the heat using a heat embossing tool. As the powder and paper heat up, the powder begins to melt and turn shiny. It's seriously the most magical thing, and I absolutely love watching the transformation every single time I heat emboss. As you can see, the addition of the embossing powder just adds another layer of shimmer and shine to the paper. Next, I'm going to be creating some stamped embellishments for the card using images from the Foreboding stamp set. Here I've placed a piece of distressed watercolor paper into my stamping platform, and I'm going to stamp these images using black soot archival ink. I originally played around with using the scroll-like images, but after thinking about the placement of them on the card, I decided to just stamp the candle and the skull. I I stamped the image several times to get a nice dark stamped image. The small black thing I'm using in my hand is called a Stampendable Stamp Tool, and it just allows me to apply good even pressure without having to push through my fingers. Once the images are stamped, I'm going to color them using Distress watercolor pencils. When I work with these, I like to pull the pigment from the pencil using a water brush. You could also use a wet paintbrush to do the same thing. I then apply the pigment that I picked up with the water brush onto the paper and color in the image. Here I'm using old paper to color in the skull. Remember to start off with less color on your brush, as you can always add layers of color to build them up and make them darker. I did color in the candle, but because I don't end up using it in the final project, I skipped over that part. After I finished watercoloring the images, I used my heat tool to dry the paper. When working with the Distress watercolor pencils over stamped images, you will notice that they will layer over the ink and cause it to become less bold. To remedy that, I like to place the image back into my stamping platform and restamp the image. If you're worried about getting things lined back up to restamp, you could always just color the image while it's still in the stamping platform. After I restamped the image, I used a pair of detail scissors to fussy cut the skull image from the paper. Next up, I wanted to create a stamped piece to layer behind the skull. I took a piece of Distress watercolor paper and adhered it inside my stamping platform using repositionable adhesive. I then began stamping images from the Obscurity stamp set onto the paper using black soot archival ink. I chose this permanent ink for my stamping because I knew I was going to be adding some ink smushing during the next step. As I stamped the script image, I decided to hold the stamp with my fingers as I didn't want to stamp the entire image each time, but just parts of it here and there to fill in the design. With the stamping completed, I'm now going to do some ink smushing to add some color to the paper I just stamped. Here I'm taking old paper Distress ink and smushing the ink pad onto my craft mat. I then spritz the ink with some water and then smush my paper into the ink. I use my finger to push sections of the paper into the ink. I repeat this several times until I'm happy with how it looks, and then I take my heat tool and dry the paper. Once it was dry, I decided to add a bit more ink by smushing the paper back into the ink that was still on my craft mat, and then dried the paper once more. To add a little more interest, I then added some larger water droplets by slowly pulling the trigger of the Distress sprayer. I began to dry the paper with my heat tool, and then I used a paper towel to dab dry and lift off the still wet ink. I then finished drying the paper with my heat tool. The stamped layer was a bit too large to fit on my background papers, so I tore the edge of the paper and used the Distress head of the Sizzix Surface multi-tool set to give it a more distressed look. I continued tearing the paper and distressing the edge of it until I was happy with the size. It ended up being about 2 by 5 inches once I was done with it. Next, I inked the edges of this piece and the skull with Gathered Twigs Distress ink. Then, once again, I added some large water droplets by slowly pulling the trigger of the Distress sprayer. I dabbed the ink dry and lifted off some of the ink with a paper towel and then dried it with my heat tool. Some of you may have seen mica tiles before, but they are new to me, and this is my first time to add them to a project. If you aren't familiar with them, mica tiles are compressed layers of naturally mined mica. They are heat-resistant, multi-layered, transparent, acid-free, and archival safe. Because it's a natural product, each tile has unique variations and markings which make it perfect for adding a wonderfully organic touch and texture to just about any project. Here I am using them quite simply as another layer of interest on my card, but there are many ways they can be used to add texture and interest to your project. Earlier, I had thought about using the flourishes from the Foreboding stamp set, but instead I chose to add some die cuts instead. Using the Tim Holtz Adorned Thinlits die set, I cut black cardstock for an additional layer of texture and interest. For the sentiment, I stamped the October 31 image from the Obscure stamp set with embossing ink onto black cardstock and heat embossed it with gold embossing powder, just like I did for the background paper. I then trimmed this down, leaving a small border around the image. To create the layer behind the purple embossed layer, I cut a piece of gold metallic craft stock to 4 1/4 by 6 inches and distressed the edges using the same distress tool as before. I then inked the edges with black soot distress ink to darken it. Here's a look at the completed card. I adhered the skull and the date piece using double-sided foam adhesive to add a little more dimension. I then added some machine stitching around the outside edge before I adhered all of the layers together. And then to finish it off, I layered everything onto a piece of black cardstock cut to 4.5 by 6.25 inches. I hope you enjoyed learning how this Halloween card came together using some of the new stamp sets from the Tim Holtz Stampers Anonymous 2023 Halloween release. Until next time, stay crafty, my friend. Thanks so much for watching. I'm truly grateful for you. I was wondering if you could do me a quick favor and subscribe to my channel or leave me a thumbs up or a comment. If you're feeling extra generous, I'd love for you to share about my channel with your friends. All of these things help out us YouTubers so much, and it would mean so much to me to have your support.